Again, you'd be walking home and there'd be some kid standing in the weeds photographing a chair strapped to a light post. Are you in my class? No? Okay. I got nothing. The one on the right is one of my favorites. That's the engineering building. You can tell it looks sort of aesthetically like an engineering building. I'll leave it at that. Not a particularly warm and inviting place that they've created there. You can tell a little bit in that photograph from all the daylight that's flooding in from the right side of the slide that that's the great view. And it turns out, after the acres of sort of parking at the edge of campus, is a really glorious view of the skyline of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And to the left is actually the dark and dreary engineering building that this kid here had just come out of a final exam or a midterm exam or some sort of anxiety-filled, stress-filled moment of their college career. And one of our students had placed that white folding chair out there. The picnic table was kind of ratty. It was used as much as an ashtray as it was as a picnic table. You didn't really want to eat on it or sit on it. So they placed the chair out there, and this kid came out after a tough exam, dropped the backpack, just kind of kicked back, and sat there for about 20 minutes and did nothing but chill out and stare at the mountains. And I thought, what a great way to influence somebody's life. What a great way to have a difference in somebody's career on campus in a way that's completely unexpected. So at first we thought this was just sort of an unusual hypothetical exercise about place as a verb and placemaking, but it turned out that we actually made a few people's lives a little bit better over the course of it. So that was kind of a nice little moment for us as well. That was a good day in class. So we've been looking at the world. We've been trying to find a critical apparatus to help us look at the world. We've been starting to place things in the world, but what we really want to do is we want to make stuff, right? I mean, that's really where we're sort of headed here, right? And how do we start making stuff given this knowledge? And one of the things that we found at Virginia Tech, if you guys know Virginia Tech at all, you probably know that they have sort of a pretty stellar football team. And they have an increasingly competitive basketball team. But for about 100 years now, they've been best known as having a really stellar engineering program, back since the days when it was Virginia Polytechnic Institute and VPI. But one of the things that they found, I was teaching foundation courses in architecture, and we were meeting with the foundation instructors in engineering, and what they had found was that the typical kid who would go to engineering a generation ago was that type of person who would take apart a lawnmower in the garage and would build a go-kart out of it. They would take apart a vacuum cleaner that was broken, and they would make a working particle accelerator in the basement. They would take apart a chainsaw and they would create something new out of it. But they knew how machines worked, they knew mechanics, they knew how parts worked, gears worked, levers worked. They knew about the physical world in ways that today's engineering students do not. That was what they had found there at Virginia Tech, is that today's engineering students are the type of student who gravitates towards engineering as a field, tends to know a lot about how to operate a computer, but very little about how the computer actually works. It used to be that you could take apart the back of a computer and put in your own video card, put in your own memory, put in your own hard drive, because that's the way they were designed to be empowering for those kids who knew how to take apart a lawnmower. Right? And now it's a box, and if it doesn't work, we ship it off to 1-800-TOSHIBA and get it fixed, and hopefully they'll send us a new one that will work. And it's a sort of different mindset to the students. And what they found was they had to create a whole series of classes. So the freshman class in engineering now, all you do for a semester is take stuff apart and put it back together. And take it apart and put it back together in different ways. You take apart toasters, you take about all kinds of different machines just to learn about the mechanics of the world. Now, we were doing some similar exercises in architecture, and we had done some of these in London as well. We went around and we got every bicycle that we could get at the impound lot, every bicycle at a thrift shop, and everybody had several bicycles to work with, and we basically took them apart to help understand their architecture and to help understand how they worked. So we did a couple things with them. We did drawings full scale with the parts, tried to understand the relationships of the parts and the pieces that made these things work. And to see what we could then construct from them. This was again in Blacksburg. The next slide is actually from a couple projects in London. And these are two very different ways of reassembling those parts once you've taken it apart to figure out what your pieces are. What do you then make from that? The one on the left is upside down, but I guess that probably doesn't matter. It was a guy named Shin Egashira, and Shin is a sort of sculptor, and he makes these mobile kinetic things. This was actually a fish sculpture made out of bicycles, made out of car parts, made out of an old turntable. And when you turn this thing in and plugged it in, all the different gears worked and sort of flopped like a fish, and it moved in that way that a fish body would move. And he actually put it on wheels so it would make its way around the gallery when you plugged it in. And then he had like big fish and small fish, and you'd try to walk around the gallery and not get hit by the different fish. But it was the whole sort of motion and kinetics of it was based on his understanding of how those parts worked and how that gravity worked. Now there were a couple other kids on the other side of the school who were taking these things apart, and what they found was if they cut that frame of the bicycle at a critical point, they could bend those triangles around, they could take the wheels off like a mountain bike tires, they could use the axles, and they really only had to make like 3 new parts, and they could produce these wheelchairs. And so what they did is they made these gigantic sort of off-road mountain biking wheelchairs, and then they sent them down to Africa through Oxfam, just sort of like our Peace Corps, that a lot of students in England would go down into Africa and formerly colonized parts of the British Empire and try to make up for past deeds. But these guys went down and brought a bunch of wheelchairs to these communities that had no paved roads. So they had to have sort of mountain biking type of equipment to be able to get around. And one of the little villages actually started a basketball league, which was kind of cool. As much as I love the fish, you know, in the sort of artistic development of it, you know, the social component of architecture in the world has a slightly different sort of end to things. So I'm going to show you one more project. And this is a little bit more studio related. This is definitely in the studio. The studio is a really, really wonderful and unique environment. It's very, very personal. Right? It's about your own personal exploration, your personal expression, your personal development as a designer who will go out and operate on that world. But it's also incredibly social. Architecture and design are team sports. Lots of people participate in making the world. A lot of people participate and have a stake in the world. A lot of people will help us to find that place where we will actually operate on. So how we sort of negotiate these two, I always find to be a really sort of important undercurrent in how we think about how we construct problems and operate within the studio. So this is a project we did here in Vegas a couple years ago. We're trying to get a handle on place. We're trying to get a handle on this place that changes so rapidly. Trying to get a handle on this place that is moving quickly, that has a lot of players involved in that negotiation. The slide on the left is Joseph Hartwig's chess set from the Bauhaus in 1923. To me, it looked incredibly architectural, almost looked urban in a way. And what was great is every time you moved a few chess pieces, you could see the chess game, but you could also start to see these cities emerge and evolve. We wanted to combine it with checkers so you could actually king me and make taller buildings at the same time. But we started to come up with these games where you could create a set of urban chess. You could have rules, you could have games, you could have game boards, you could create your own pieces, you could move those pieces, and you could create different types of arrangements and places through that negotiation between who's playing the different types of pieces. The slide on the other side was one that we were looking at. It's actually a watercolor of a reef. And it's actually a flyer and an ad for a construction company in Las Vegas that does residential work. And we thought it was really quite sort of evocative. The way the different layers of color come together, and it's not just about one color, but it's about how all those different layers in the watercolor come together to create that image that we see. But it's also an image of a reef, and a reef is a really sort of wonderful metaphor for the city, in that this thing grows sort of organically, it grows over time. There's lots of different forces that shape that reef, but the reef is also inhabited by plants, it's inhabited by fish, it's inhabited by predators, it's inhabited by plankton, it's inhabited by all kinds of different things that make that a wonderful place. So we decided to start to find a way where we could create our own sort of urban chess and our own sort of residential reef at the same time. So we took a look at a little section right across the street, actually. This little triangular dirt lot over here that is now the construction parking for the Greenspun building. And we decided to construct some games where we could produce residential options for campus. Right? What exactly does a residence, what should a residence look like for a city that is exciting, that's vibrant, that's full of signage, that's heroic, that's ugly, whose context is changing, that's full of light, that's full of color, right? That's full of symbolism, that's all those things that Venturi talked about, all those things that we're finding before. So this thing, what we did is we set up some games where you would place things in this model, you would move things in this model, you got scored on your participation, you got graded and evaluated by your classmates and by anybody else who happened to be walking by the studio at any given time, and this thing continued to grow. And as it continued to grow as a physical form in the studio, what also continued to grow was our conversations about what a residence should be like. Should there be classrooms in this residential complex, or should the dorms be over here, and should the classroom be over here? Well, if really I'm putting a dorm on campus, isn't that a space I'm supposed to learn from being in that space? Why not actually merge those two together? Should there be private spaces and public spaces in the same space? Well, yeah, that seems like a pretty good idea. How do we construct that? And every time everybody had a good idea, they went about adding it to the model. And this thing continued to grow and continued to flourish over time. We need more signage, we need more wayfinding, we don't know where we're at. We need more color, we need more views, we need more mystery, we need more drama, right? One of the problems with the campus as it was defined by the students was there wasn't any drama to it. Perhaps if there was a little bit of mystery, our days would be a little more interesting on that campus. Where are the opportunities? And one of the things that was funny is we made this out of just about anything we could find. Right? Material is sort of expensive, so we found stuff out of the trash, right? The old objet trouvé, right? If you want to be sort of fancy about it, right? We have a great long-standing tradition in the field of art by taking trash and building stuff out of it. This actually a packet of sponges from Walgreens makes a nice little skyscraper, starts to give it some scale. We found just about anything we could, a box of butter, a can of soda, anything. And what you did was you said, all right, I'm not going to build a building that looks like a gigantic Diet Peach Snapple tower, but I'm going to place something there to say, I think we need a tower here. And I'll get back to you in a couple days with a more refined version of it. And in the meantime, other people would start placing things next to it. I like what you're doing with your tower. I'm going to put something big and massive over here. And then by the next day, somebody has replaced their tower with something else, and this thing just continued to grow. Every time you came into studio, you were confronted with something completely different. Context is always changing. One of the things that's really great about building in this town is that by the time you're done thinking of it, drawing it up, getting the financing for it, sending it out to bid, getting it constructed, I can guarantee that all four sides of your project are going to be completely different than the day you started, right? That's one of the great things about this town. Things happen lickety-split, and that's sort of wonderful. So we had these moves. You could add stuff to this model. You could take stuff away from this model. You could move stuff to more appropriate places if you could make a good argument for why it should be more appropriate. And this little guy here, this little clearly Canadian bottle, was one of the great little parts of this whole studio, because half the studio really loved it and the other half really hated it. And so half the studio would come in and, gee, I didn't see any clearly Canadian bottle. And then the next day somebody else would, aggressively put that thing back in, and then it would get taken back out, and then it would get put back in. And at some point, there was one woman in particular who kept becoming the advocate for the clearly Canadian bottle. And we said, why do you keep putting this thing back in here? And what was great was, as she kept putting it back in, it kept getting placed in increasingly sophisticated places, right? So she was getting better at her placing as she kept working through this. And we said, why do you keep putting this thing back in there? She said, because it's sexy. Okay, I like that. When was the last time you heard a project defined as, or described as sexy, right? Why is that not part of our vocabulary as designers in this town, right? I mean, I think it should be. When was the last time you heard a student project defined or described as sexy? Probably even rarer than that, right? So all of a sudden, sex and sex appeal and sexiness started to become part of our vocabulary, right? As we continue to grow our vocabulary, as we continue to grow in our sophistication and how we place these things in the landscape. And it continued to get completely out of hand the more this thing moved.